Deirdre, Lucas is anam dom, tal gelgergum, ac nilim leafa. Hello again. If you just listen to what I said, you may recognize it as Gaeilge, which is the proper name for Irish, the Irish language. So, this video, it's about why people in Ireland mostly speak English. Now, as you probably know, I'm not actually Irish. I've been living here for a very long time, and I have learned Irish. I think the first time I came across Irish, someone actually speaking Gaeilge, was my former partner, and she was pretty fluent, and that was about 30 odd years ago. Anyway, so since then I've kind of picked up some as I went, especially when my daughter went to school. I made more efforts to learn it, because she started learning it when she went to school at the age of 5. And yeah, I've done a course in Irish as well. So I would say I'm not very good. I probably have a level about a 4-year-old. So I'm not fluent, but I can just about manage to get by. It's difficult for me, I have to say, because it's completely and utterly different from any other language that I've come across. So anyway, the simple answer to that question is, of course, British colonialism. That is the reason, you could say, in a nutshell, why people speak English. But there is a kind of level of complexity if you kind of want to elaborate on that answer, which is what I'm going to do. I'm going to try and go into it a bit more, a bit of a deep dive, if you will, although I keep it as short as I can. Okay, so if you don't know, it's actually a very old language. Gaeilge is thousands of years old, and it has changed. It may be the native language of Ireland. There's been many waves of invasion over time, long before the English came. So we don't actually know how much of it is original native or influenced by the waves of prehistorical invaders. By prehistoric, I mean before, genuinely corroborated written accounts of the various invasions that happened, which you'll find in a book called The History of the Taking of Ireland, or it's often referred to as the Book of Invasions as well. And also its Irish name is Le Bol Gabala Erin. So anyway, it's actually closer related to Welsh and Latin than any other European languages. So it has very, very little resemblance to English. You get some loan words, and so this process, what's called burlicus, which is where English words are creeping in. Like car is an English word that's become common in Irish, but the real word is glúisteán. That's the proper name that you should be using. Obviously, some words like telefish come directly from television, and there's no precedent for that. There weren't televisions around when Irish was first spoken, and sure, virtually every new invention that's come along seems to have an English name, pretty much, and those are sort of generally transferred across the world. I suppose that's just the nature of modern technology. It tends to be anglicised because of the prevalence of English across much of the world. So anyway, getting back to what I was saying about Ireland, it being a very old language, if you compare it with English, that's sort of a language that was sort of still being sort of formed in the sort of 900s. and that's very, very different today from, English from that time period was very Germanic and completely and utterly different from, what if you would try to read some English from that time period, you'd have great difficulty in understanding it. To some extent, Irish has also changed a lot. Old Irish is very different from modern Irish, but not quite so radically changed as English. You would have found that at the time of the Norman Conquest, which was 1169, the people arriving in to conquer Ireland were not English speakers. They were French speakers. They were nearly all French, and there were some Flemish people as well, and a few Welsh. So none of them would have spoken English, more than likely. So they became the kind of first colonizers since the arrival of the Gaels in Ireland, and they settled, as many know, became this sort of Anglo-Irish, and people suggested at times that they became more Irish than the Irish, and that they settled down and began to speak Irish. They began to adopt Irish customs, which meant that by the time of the Statutes of Kilkenny, which is passed in 1366, I think, yeah, that's right, these laws were designed to kind of ban Irish culture because of the creeping Gaelicization of all the colonists. So this was meant to reverse that, but it actually failed miserably. So you have a situation where the colonizers are becoming native. They're becoming part of a native culture, and that obviously worried the English royalty, and they tried to reverse it. At this time, still, you've got a situation where the English aristocracy and the kings of that time didn't actually speak English still. They're still Norman and Plantagenet descended French speakers. So they're trying to force English culture on Ireland at the time when they don't even have English culture themselves. If you went to the court of an English king at that time, everyone would have been speaking French. There would be no English spoken whatsoever. So it's a bit of a strange situation, that really. So the Morse statutes were introduced in 1495, 1537, Henry VIII attempting to implement these statutes again, which again failed. I mean, by that time, Henry VIII was speaking English. I think it was the first English king who actually spoke English was Henry IV. There was a few Henrys prior to him. That would have been the 15th century that finally, aristocrats and, royalty actually started using the language of England instead of the French, which had been the case prior to that. So a very long time that the sort of common people of England spoke sort of a version of English that we're not so familiar with, but the upper classes, the aristocrats, the royalty, they still stuck to the French of the Norman invaders who'd arrived in England 100 years before they arrived in Ireland. So at this stage, you've still got a situation where most people are speaking Irish. About 80% of the people are speaking in Irish, and in the area known as the Pale, or the colony, you've got a higher number of English speakers. But of course, this wasn't an English city. Dublin, the Pale, and the area around it was actually a Viking city. So originally the inhabitants would have been speaking Norse, and then they spoke some Irish, or a bit of both. and then eventually it became conquered by the Normans, and then you started to see a bit of English creeping in. But even at that time of Henry VIII, the Parliament there was mostly in Irish, a Scoilge. So, I mean, his government were fairly disgusted with the situation. They thought it was appalling that so few people in the Irish Parliament actually spoke English. So that's one of the reasons they tried to re-implement these statutes that had failed before. And of course, it failed once again. And it's not really till towards the end of the reign of his daughter, Elizabeth I, that you start to see a significant shift. So you had this 9 Years' War, which ultimately led to the defeat of the O'Neills and his kind of confederacy, and the flight of the Earls in 1607, which was sort of the abandonment of Ireland by the Gaelic order, or the aristocracy of Ireland, if you like. So you started to see in the reign of James I the plantations, the settlements of Ulster with new people, and ironically, about 50% or so of these people were Scottish people, and many from the Western Lowlands, and a lot of the people in certainly the western half of Scotland was very, very heavily populated, some like 1,000 years or more earlier by the Irish. It was like, I suppose, Ireland's only colony, if you like, was a tiny bit of Wales and a massive portion of Scotland. So many of the people that had originally come from Ireland, settled in Scotland, they were then sent back to Ireland as colonists. The plantation of Presbyterian ulster-scots people. There were quite a lot of English people as well, but at least 50% of the people seem to have come from Scotland over a period starting from 1607 and going on till about 1700 or so. And many of them spoke what's called ulster-scots, which is a sort of a weird combination of Scots Gaelic, English, and a bit of Ulster Irish. So it's sort of it's not really Pidgin English or Pidgin Irish, it's somewhere in between the two. So it's sort of it's neither English or Scots or Irish, but bits of all of them. Maybe pieces that English speakers will recognise and Scots and Irish speakers will recognise, but somewhat difficult to understand if you don't actually speak that dialect or language, if you will, yourself. So anyway, you got more laws again to try and crush the Irish language and Irish culture, the penal laws of 1695, which weren't fully repealed until 1829. But even at this point, you've still got a massive amount of Irish speakers. In about 1800, you've got about 70% of people in the country spoke Irish, and then the rest of them speaking either English or ulster-scots. So at the time of the famine, the beginning of the famine, which was and Gorta Mór, it's called in Scoilge, which means the Great Hunger. You had still, even then, around 50% or more of the population, which was about 8 million. At least half of them, well, more than half of them, more than 4 million people spoke Irish fluently. Okay, this was the real, I suppose, start of the massive decline. This is really the crux of the decline in Ireland, because at about 1870, 25% spoke Irish, and that's 25% of the remaining 4 million people. So you have to remember the fact that there were formerly 8, and it went down by approximately half due to people, about half the people that died about half the people that disappeared from the population. 2 million of them, that's half of those people, they died, and the other 2 million emigrated. So you have a population cut in half, and then of the half that remain, only about 25% of the population are Irish speakers. So that was a massive blow to the Irish language. So following on from the famine, you have a situation where there's continual emigration, and people were encouraged to speak English because at that point the British Empire was the biggest empire in the world. They had a lot of colonies all over the world. So if you could speak English, you could probably go to New Zealand or to Australia or to America, or you can go to Canada and some other places in India or in Africa, for instance, as well. That if you could speak English, you had the possibility of work and setting up a life for yourself. And if you didn't, it would be a lot more difficult. So that was one reason why people switched to speaking English, to a large extent. And of course, the situation in Ireland itself meant that if you did speak English, your ability to get work was much greater. And with the high level of poverty, you had a situation where parents actually would encourage their children to learn English and not speak Irish at all, or only at home. So a continued degrading of the language and it becoming less and less important and significant. Very much to do with just the basics, economics of staying alive, feeding yourself, being able to pay the rent, being a massive factor in this. And so this decline has continued through the 19th century, through the 20th century, to a situation today. The census of 2016, the CSO data, shows that around 40% of people speak some Irish. Now that doesn't sound too bad, but that might include only a few words. The few words an cúpla focal. Maybe people can just say hello, goodbye, a couple of sentences, and that they're included in that 40%. So actually, people who use Irish to speak on a daily basis, that is more indicative of how things actually are. That's between 2 and 3% of the current population. And the population of the Republic is about, I think about 5.5 million. The whole island altogether is about 7 million in the latest data. And Northern Ireland, the level of uptake of Irish is much, much smaller than it is in the Republic. So that's a bit of a sad situation, and there's various arguments within the country about Ireland being the national language and it should be protected, and efforts made to increase its usage. And then you have some people arguing that it's redundant, it's useless, and we should just forget about it and stop putting money into the Gaeltacht and into funding schools for the learning of Irish, and the Gael schools, which are Irish only speaking schools too. So I'd be inclined to agree with the former rather than the latter, that it is part of the national culture, it's a unique language, it's a very ancient language, and it's part of the culture of this country and should always remain so. I think it would be a terrible shame if the government were to decide to just abandon it altogether. That would be an absolute disaster for the country, I think. So there are economic arguments. Some people regard it as a waste of money, but can you put an economic value on culture? I wonder if you can. I don't think it's something you can really value in economic terms. So regardless of what it costs, I think it is part of a national identity, and I think effort should be made to continue to grow the language and encourage both young people and older people to use it, not just to learn it, but to use it as a real living language rather than something you just sit there learning, how to say the grammar and how to rattle off a load of verbs. That's not real life language. I think actually speaking it as a real language rather than learning it in an academic way is the way that you get to learn any language really proficiently, is to use it in normal everyday life. And that has been a bit of a problem for the attempts to revive Irish, in that there's been very much an academic approach to trying to revive it instead of teaching people the basics of how to use it. You think about little children at 18 months, 2 years, they don't have grammar lessons. They just learn how to speak, and the grammar and correct usage comes later on when they're older. And that's just the nature of learning language. You have to start with the basics and build up, not trying to run before you walk. So anyway, I hope you found that interesting. That's a very, very potted history of how we got to this situation where most people use English on a daily basis in this country, and such a small number of people speak the national language on a daily basis. Hopefully that will begin to change, and I'd like to see more people using it, because it is quite a beautiful language, and there's so much historical documentation and books written in the Irish language, which unfortunately for most people are inaccessible because so few people have the language skills to actually read and understand it, which is a great pity. So anyway, hope you enjoyed that. Give me a like if you did enjoy what I had to say, and feel free to comment and subscribe. Thanks for watching. That's all for now. Bye-bye.